Can I invite everyone to take their seats, please? Welcome back. I hope you all have your cups of nice coffee and glasses of water. Come back in, let's settle down. Okay, thank you very much. We're going to move on now. As you've probably all seen, we've got quite a packed agenda this afternoon. It's a really rich debate. We've just had a really good discussion, I think, on the inequitable distribution of environmental hazards and amenities. And now we move on to the question of whether the distribution of costs and benefits of environmental policy is even and fair. So in some ways, are we making other problems through environmental policy? So we're going to move on now. We've got four good speakers. Joseph Shapiro, professor at University of California, who's online. Mathilde Vianot from the Project Manager in Fair Transition in the Office of the Prime Minister here in France. Amanda Monforton, Director for Policy Development, Environment and Climate Change in Canada. And Manisha Amantharanu, apologies, professor from Sciences Po here in France. We've given them a couple of questions to sort of try and focus the presentations on the challenges faced when evaluating the distribution of costs and benefits policies. What are the challenges? And then what's the available evidence tell us about those distributions, and what are the research and data gaps? We don't have much time, so I'm going to pass straight on. The panelists have been asked to sort of keep it to 11 minutes. So Professor Joseph Shapiro, I'm hoping you're online to tell us about empirical evidence.
Excellent. I'm hoping you can see these slides.
Perfect.
Excellent. I'm delighted to be able to join you and regret that a prior commitment meant I have to join in 2 dimensions rather than 3 and can't be there in person. But I'm excited about this workshop and discussion. I'm going to talk about research that I conducted jointly with my colleague Reid Walker here at UC Berkeley. And I want to tell you about 2 concepts and the relationship between them. One concept is the idea of environmental markets. It's a set of environmental policies which use prices or quantities to change the location and the level of pollution. Environmental markets include pollution taxes, that's a price instrument. Also cap and trade markets, that's a quantity instrument. And economists often highlight these types of policies because they minimize the amount of pollution for a given level of cost, or equivalently, they minimize the cost for a given level of pollution. And so economists would refer to them as cost effective. And they're a different set of policies than standards or command and control policies that stipulate exactly how much pollution each source must emit. So that's one concept, environmental markets. The second concept, which is the focus of this conference, is environmental justice. It's the idea that environmental quality and environmental policy should be inclusive, participatory, respectful. It should lead to fair treatment of all groups. It should emphasize equal quality of environmental outcomes. And a motivating concern for the environmental justice movement, especially in the US, is the observation that vulnerable communities, low income, and communities of color disproportionately experience high pollution levels. What I want to talk to you about in my remaining 9 or so minutes is how these 2 concepts relate to each other and whether environmental markets have a specific implication for environmental justice. A broad concern that has arisen in political discussions in the last several years is that environmental markets, unlike environmental standards, do not guarantee the exact distribution of pollution. If you use a standard that says this factory has to emit this amount and this power plant has to emit this amount, policy is stipulating exactly what the environmental outcomes will be. Whereas if you use more flexible tools like pollution taxes or cap and trade markets, it doesn't lead to that exact certainty of precisely how much each source will emit. In the US, that's led to some political debates about whether environmental markets as a policy tool could have adverse implications for environmental justice as an outcome. That came up in Washington State's debate of a carbon tax. It's come up in discussions of California renewing its state cap and trade bill, AB 32. It came up in discussions of who would lead the US Environmental Protection Agency. So I'm going to talk about some research that we conducted to understand for a specific set of environmental markets what they mean for environmental justice. I'm going to talk about a component of the US Clean Air Act, which requires that if a new pollution source opens in a city, they have to pay an existing pollution source to reduce their pollution emissions. The Clean Air Act calls this in the US emissions reductions credits, but we'll just refer to it as offset markets. And you may have heard of carbon offsets and wetland offsets. This is the same idea for air pollution. It's one of the oldest and broadest market-based environmental policies in the US. It creates hundreds of local pollution markets because in every city, for each pollutant, if a new power plant or factory or other source opens, they have to pay an existing pollution source to decrease their pollution, and then trading happens between the new and the existing source. And the question we want to ask is, where are those sources emitting pollution? Is this kind of market-based policy reallocating pollution from rich to poor communities, or from predominantly white to predominantly minority communities? How is this kind of policy leading to relocation of pollution? And the research I'm talking about is summarized in these two papers. You can find them on my website, or they're freely available online. We're going to use data on individual transactions between factories from the two states that require public disclosure of these transactions, California and Texas. This is a total of 12 environmental markets. Before summarizing this particular research, I want to tell you this is emblematic of a broader research agenda that's been happening recently. The goal of this agenda is to understand, how does environmental policy affect environmental inequality? And then more broadly, how does the choice of environmental policy instrument affect inequality? If you use pollution taxes versus cap and trade markets versus standards, do those have different implications for environmental inequality? I'm going to very briefly summarize this research and then tell you about our specific paper. My reading of the emerging research is that environmental policy tends to decrease pollution levels overall. And because predominantly minority communities begin with higher pollution levels, they tend to have larger decreases from the Clean Air Act and from other policies that tend to target the most polluted areas. At the same time, despite benefits from the Clean Air Act and related policies, minority and low-income communities continue to have higher pollution levels, even though all communities have benefited from these national policies. When you turn to the second branch of this research that asks, how does the choice of policy tool, whether you use standards or pollution taxes or cap and trade markets, how does that affect environmental inequality? My summary of this research is it somewhat depends on the exact policy, and also whether you look at where pollution is emitted, or if you look at the ambient air and water quality where pollution affects ambient environmental quality. Some of these markets modestly increase environmental inequality, some of them modestly decrease environmental inequality. My synopsis is there's no systematic relationship between whether you're using standards or environmental markets, between the choice of environmental policy instrument and the impact on environmental inequality. And you could see that as good because it means you can separate the choice of policy tool versus impact on inequality. Or you could see it as bad because it's saying the existing tools aren't systematically addressing inequality. You need to specifically design those tools to address inequality. So let me tell you about this specific set of environmental markets that we studied. I'll just summarize it for the last 4 or so minutes. This picture summarizes how these Clean Air Act offset markets work in the US. Imagine there's an existing company emitting 200 tons of pollution per year. Imagine this existing company reduces its emissions by 140 tons. Perhaps it builds a scrubber or selective catalytic reduction or some other abatement technology that decreases its emissions. This factory gets a certificate called an emissions reductions credit, which gets saved until a new factory wants to open, and then it sells this certificate to the new factory. Sometimes the reduction and the opening happen at the same time. The new factory is emitting a similar amount. And so in this way, the entrant is essentially paying the incumbent to decrease its emissions. And this ensures that the city as a whole doesn't increase emissions. At the same time, it's important to know where are the decreases occurring and where are the increases occurring. This is just one example of these certificates. This is a factory called ScanPack Manufacturing. It's located in a suburb of Houston. They installed a pollution control technology called a thermal oxidizer. It decreased emissions of a type of air pollution called volatile organic compounds by 21.8 tons per year. And later they sold that to an oil company for $3 or $4 million, which wanted to increase its own emissions. So what we did was look at each of the pollution sources selling and buying these offsets. Those are places where pollution is increasing versus decreasing. And we drew a 1-mile circle around each of these sources and asked what share of household in those circles identify as Black, what share identify as Hispanic, and what share have income below the poverty line. These graphs show the distribution of these characteristics across sources that are increasing pollution, that's the red line, where the pollution offsets are purchased, that's a new or expanding plant, versus sources that are decreasing pollution, that's the dashed blue line. So the horizontal axis here is saying what share of the community around these different factories identifies as Black, and the vertical axis is a smooth way of saying how many factories have this demographic characteristic. And the main point I want you to see here is that the red and blue lines are pretty similar. These vertical lines show the mean, they're almost exactly on top of each other. And a way to say this in standard language is that communities where pollution is increasing and communities where pollution is decreasing have very similar shares of the population that identifies as Black. This is looking at transactions through these 12 Clean Air Act offset markets. This graph is showing the share of these communities where households identify as Hispanic. It's using data from the US population census in the year 2010. Again, these smooth lines are showing the distribution across all the factories that are increasing or decreasing pollution through these offset transactions under the Clean Air Act. And these vertical lines show the mean share of communities that are increasing pollution versus decreasing pollution, the mean share that's Hispanic. Again, these shares are very similar. The locations where pollution is increasing due to these market transactions and communities where pollution is decreasing have very similar shares of the population that identify as Hispanic. And the last graph I'm going to show you is the share of population which has income below the poverty line. And this graph is showing the median household income. And if anything, these graphs show pollution is tending to move to slightly higher income communities because of these transactions. None of these differences are statistically significant. And broadly, they suggest that these Clean Air Act transactions, they're not substantially changing the distribution of where pollution is located. So let me sum up to say, you could see this as a positive because it means you can choose environmental policies that are the most cost-effective, or you may see it as a negative to say these policies are not specifically designed to fix environmental inequality. To do that, you need to have policies that have that specific type of targeting. Thanks very much. I'm going to stop screen sharing now.
Thank you very much for that. I think that's nicely boiled down and quite replicable to other issues as well. I'll pass the floor now to Matilda for the perspective from the French side on distribution of costs and benefits.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you very, very much for having me here. So I will mainly talk about trends and mitigation policies. So first, the policymakers used to balance between costs and benefits, but they used to do it in a growing context, and growth was seen as a gradual and continuous improvements, of living conditions. But when we are talking about mitigation policies, the context is quite different. And so you can call it stagnation, post-growth, or degrowth. Well, it's the same for the policymaker, because it means that he will have to mainly share costs. And so this is much more difficult for him for financing these policies, for the trade-offs, but also for the narrative who have behind, because he won't have any political traction to help him implementing such policies. So having said that, I think when we want to share costs about mitigation policies, you have to tackle three main questions. The first one is who will be the most impacted by mitigation policies. So first you can look at the direct impact. And so you can measure it by looking at what we call the energy effort weight. And so you can saw it on the figure here. So we draw it for household income deciles. And so you can see that the energy bill weighs much more on the very low income households than the top 10 one. And so this is also the case for people who live in sparsely areas, for young people who use more their plane or their car, or a plane, and people who have wood or oil heating. You also can look at indirect impacts of such policies. The first one is through prices, and so those who are highly dependent on high carbon goods will be more impacted by prices. But you can also look at employment impacts, and because we know that there will be significant reallocation of jobs, mainly between brown sectors to green ones. And so this will cause polarization, because we will need more construction workers, more engineers, but less middle-skilled workers. And we already have lived job transition in the past. And the main one is deindustrialization. And so this is the map you can see here. You can see territories where jobs in the industry haven't been compensated by jobs in service industry, so the red ones. And so I think it's important to say that perfect transition is a pipe dream, and so there will be huge losses. The second question is who can adapt, and the capacity to change is unevenly distributed. First, because you have what we call lock-in phenomena. So it's when your consumption is due to past investments, and so this is for example the case when you chose where to live, or the distance you have from work. And you can measure this capacity through an effort rate. So it's how much you have to spend to change your car, to renovate your home, as a percentage of your annual revenue. And so this is the table you can see here. So for instance, if you want to purchase an electric car for the very low income households, this is more than 2 years of revenue, and even for the middle class is more than 1 year. And so this for the policymaker help us to know who should be supported. And for instance, if in France we want to subsidize heat pumps, this costs more than 200 billion euros. And if we want to subsidize the 30% poorest household only, this will still cost 40 billion euros. And so I think it's quite important to have these figures in mind. And to exemplify this inability to change, I want to talk about the farmers' protest we experienced in France earlier this year, because their income is based on productivism. So it's a model focused on production. They own the means of production, and the maximum development of mechanization and pesticides. And so they have a rush to productivity. They are much anxious about market uncertainties, like a rise in energy prices, and they have to cope with the with new standards that run against their past investments. So this is a typical lock-in phenomenon, and they have to cope with social and generational demands to change this model. So this gives farmers socially unacceptable positions. And so this is for me the perfect example of an inability to adapt, and that brings political deadlocks. And so the last question, I think, is who will accept to change? And so here we are talking about sociological factors, so which are practices that reflect consumer norms and symbols which are specific to each social group. So this is, for instance, the case with the private car, or in France with the red meat. And so still for a policymaker, it's very key to keep these factors in mind, to not to live what we experience with the Yellow Vest movement. So last, to conclude, I want to show you this figure from the World Inequality Lab. So on the left, you have the bottom 50% household, the middle class, and the top 10. So in in red, it's the losses they will live from climate change. In green, their greenhouse emissions, and in blue, the capacity to finance the change. And so I think this figure urges us to rethink environmental fairness, and further than what we do in France when we only talk about price signal and compensations. Thank you very much.
And thank you. And we'll pass now on to Manisha, please, for a more global perspective.
Thank you very much. And that follows on quite well to what I want to say, which is in my talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about the global implications of domestic environmental policies, and specifically in relation to the global circular economy transition. And in addition to my work, my own research, I'll be drawing a little bit on the work of my colleagues at Chatham House and the Circular Economy Program. So circular economy can be thought of as an EJ 2.0 situation, using the terminology that Shardul introduced, which is implicated in rebalancing the distributions of risk and benefits through environmental policies. And I want to highlight two potential injustices that could be enacted through domestic and regional circular economy policies. A first injustice that is a consequence of exclusion and dispossession, and second, types of injustices through exploitative inclusion. So just to give a very brief background, I'm sure the circular economy needs no introduction. It's been proposed as an alternative to the linear take, make, waste model by finding ways through technology, through business models, through new ways of meeting needs, to retain resources at highest utility at all times. And at the Chatham House, this is sometimes conceptualized as acts of slowing flows, of narrowing flows, as well as by creating new loops to revalorize discards as resources. And each of these steps indeed promises some environmental justice benefits. So if flows of resource extraction are reduced, then we can hope that the environmental impacts of extractive activities like mining can be reduced. Similarly, if we find ways to reuse and reutilize products for longer periods of time, then the end life impacts can also be reduced. And indeed, these are some of the environmental justice promises of the circular economy, though it should be noted that many of these have not really been empirically demonstrated at scale yet. Now, of course, what's also important to note is that these linear economy processes that are, pictured in this previous slide, the material supply chain, design and manufacturing, distribution and use, and end of first life, in turn have a global geography and a global spatial distribution that has emerged in relation to the comparative distribution of resources, labor, but also global histories of colonialism, unequal exchange, development, and underdevelopment. And not to simplify this too much, but this global division in manufacturing, consumption, and disposal shows us that many environmental and social externalities that are unevenly distributed across value chains. So many of those externalities tend to accrue in low and middle income countries, while the use life and benefits tend to accrue in more industrialized and developed nations. And of course, we see this, for example, around statistics around waste export, the export of waste plastics from the EU to non-EU recipient countries. We see this also when we look at the global distribution of resource recovery and repair work. And so in recognition of these global interconnections and interdependencies within the circular economy, there has been a growing interest in considering the international dimensions of this. So in relation to circular trade, where I know the OECD has done important work, but also circular financing. So if we take into account where exactly this global resource recovery and repair work is currently taking place, where materials are getting shipped, and as well as where they need to be accessed from, how can this be taken into account in drafting circular economy policies at the domestic level? So with my colleagues at Chatham House, we have argued that if the circular economy is pursued as a strategy of national economic competitiveness, as it has been proposed in certain contexts, then advanced industrialized nations hold a significant competitive advantage because of pre-existing divides. And again, these divides are themselves a product of historical legacies of colonialism, and as well as ongoing unequal power structures. So to just kind of make a brief mention about what are some of these pre-existing divides that exist in the linear economy that could be reproduced in a transition to the circular economy, and in turn produce and reproduce various forms of injustice. There is the role of access to finance. So the financial investment needed to roll out circular economy related industrial infrastructure, to invest in technology and business model innovation, to develop the necessary skill base is unequally accessible. There's capacity to innovation, such as knowledge and institutional capacities of universities, science and technology. In relation to trade, where the bargaining power of developed countries to leverage trade agreements can help them, for instance, secure the supply of critical raw and secondary materials to meet domestic demand, while pressuring developing countries to accept low value or hazardous waste. And again, we've seen empirical examples of this as documented, for example, in the Environmental Justice Atlas, which was referenced earlier today. So to give you a very simple example of what something like this could look like, if you consider a situation where developed industrialized countries are demanding critical minerals from exporting developing countries to support electrification goals. And simultaneously, because they have greatest purchasing power, these electric vehicles are largely being bought and sold and bought in developed countries. And then you have a situation where at the end of life, policies are put in place to prevent the export of these materials out of a particular domestic context. And because of additional financial capacity and innovation capacity, local repair refurbishment economies are developed. Then what happens is that these materials will recirculate, ideally for a very long time within these domestic borders, meaning that developing countries are likely not to gain access to these critical materials involved in, for example, the net zero transition or in digitalization, and to meet their own development goals. So what this means is that an enhanced capacity to conduct circular economy activities within domestic borders, so repair, refurbishment, remanufacturing, ensures that the residual value of these secondary goods and materials is captured within the domestic market. And this is a likely reduction in less powerful countries' access to these high quality secondary goods, which we know today plays a very important role in meeting various development targets in developing economies. So, and over time, if this loop continues, it is likely to in turn worsen those divides on which it's based. Now, of course, to put a human face to this, we also have to consider, well, who exactly is doing a lot of the resource recovery, repair, and refurbishment work across the developing world? And so if we look at subnational patterns, we see that the acts that we consider as part of the circular economy, repair, refurbishment, recycling, are largely conducted by ethno-racially marginalized populations who work in the so-called informal economy. So across the world, a significant proportion, if not the majority of resource recovery work, takes place in the informal economy, which is a shorthand term used to refer to extra-legal economic activities not directly permitted or regulated by the state, often taking place outside of social protections and waged labor, in informal settlements and in public spaces. These circular actors, range from waste pickers and gleaners who work in municipal dumps to extract reusable and recyclable materials, to family and community micro enterprises that aggregate, dismantle, repair, and refurbish electronics to old jeans. And in cities across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, grassroots recyclers have built functioning value chains for a whole range of materials. These value chains tend to be quite labor intensive as opposed to capital driven, and they conserve energy and resources while creating livelihoods. And often the informal economy is thought of as a barrier to the circular economy transition. But in my work and in the work of several other researchers, we argue that actually they're the ones largely doing things that are identified as circular. Indeed, some studies suggest that about 20 to 50% of the waste generated in developing country cities is managed by the informal sector. And the informal sector might be responsible for 58% of all the plastic waste collected and recycled globally. So the coding of the informal sector as an aberration, something that can be regulated away, is in of itself problematic and reproduces some of those injustices which refuses to recognize the labor, the value, the knowledge contributions that informal workers make currently to managing global environments. So from this perspective, that currently environmental policies often exclude informal workers, sometimes locate them as the problem, look to get rid of them. And as a consequence, they're often not included in those procedures of environmental planning and not recognized for their expertise. Now, added to this fact, it's important also to note that informal workers in many cases are subject to gendered, racialized, and caste-based injustices. So they are people, individuals, and communities who are pushed to waste work as a consequence of various forms of structural injustices, some of which were mentioned by David in his introductory lectures. So informal workers are kind of stuck in between a rock and a hard place. So on the one hand, a lot of these circular economy policies, by trying to kind of onshore repair and refurbishment activities, threaten to dispossess their livelihoods full scale. On the other hand, their livelihoods themselves involve a range of toxicity and harm that is done upon to themselves. And thirdly, they don't really have many other livelihood opportunities because of wage stagnation, because of long-standing and important problems to do with underdevelopment. Now, today, there are a range of initiatives that are emerging that are trying to, solve this challenge by partnering directly with informal workers in global South cities to achieve some of the circular economy goals here in the EU. So, for example, you have a range of coalitions and initiatives coming up that are trying to acquire recycled plastics from waste pickers in India, in Brazil, and through this help companies in Europe meet their environmental regulations, help regulators achieve environmental goals at least cost, and in the process, accomplish cleanup operations. However, qualitative research by both, and I think the top part of this slide got cut, so apologies for that. I made these slides while living a heat wave in India last week. So, you'll have to be kind to me. It was bloody hot. So qualitative research, so this is ethnographic research looking on the ground with these communities who are participating in these partnerships, reveals that because these market-based partnerships are set up in a way where they prioritize transparency and traceability, data-based approaches, and informal workers who tend to be in many ways socio-culturally marginalized, excluded from access to data, excluded from access to technology, excluded from access to financing, they don't directly themselves benefit from these partnerships. And instead, there is a new class of startups funded by venture capital firms that are coming in and serving as intermediaries, functioning more as rent seekers, who end up actually being the ones who are able to take advantage of these new economic opportunities. And in turn, informal economies get further stratified along these ethno-racial and gendered lines. So even if some informal workers benefit, it tends to be men, it tends to be people who are more privileged within that socio-cultural context. It doesn't tend to be the women. It doesn't tend to be the people who are most marginalized in that situation. So I'll end with three very quick points. First to say, is because the linear economy is built upon and reproduces global and local inequalities and injustices, if the circular economy transition does not take account of those existing divides, it will very likely reproduce them. Secondly, these transnational market-based circular economy initiatives that do not consider existing socio-cultural patterns of injustices tied to lack of respect, lack of access to data, lack of access to financing, means that even initiatives that are meant to help the most marginalized may not end up helping them. And so to deal with this, we need more conversations, more acknowledgement of these issues, more international coordination, more investment in some of the things that have been identified in these reports that I will direct your attention to, such as education and training, investment in the actual human capacities of these workers, social protection, access to basic amenities, which many informal workers lack, as well as a broader kind of agenda to recognize the labor that these groups have already been involved in, often at cost to themselves, and to try and repair the histories of harms that have been enacted upon these groups so as to avoid a situation like this. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for bringing that dimension in. I'll pass the floor now to Amanda for a more Canadian view. Thank you.
Just wait to see the presentation on the screen. Maybe while we're waiting for the presentation to load, I'll get started. So hello, and thank you for having me here today. As mentioned, my name is Amanda Montforton. I'm the Director of Policy Development at the Strategic Policy Branch of Environment and Climate Change Canada. I'm leading a team responsible for both environmental justice and gender-based analysis plus. And so it's an especially interesting time for environmental equity conversations in Canada. The formal institutionalization of environmental justice on a national level is not only just emerging with recent addition of the right to a healthy environment and the principle of environmental justice to Canada's core federal environmental legislation. The Canadian Environmental Protection Act, in addition, legislation requiring the development of a strategy to assess, prevent, and address environmental racism and advance environmental justice is expected to pass shortly. Given these developments, a large part of policy development work to date has been taking stock in the ways in which the Canadian government is already undergoing efforts to measure the impacts of environmental policy making and take equitable approaches. So in my presentation today, I will highlight two of these approaches, discuss known challenges, and share recent learnings within the context of environmental justice policy development. And then it will also touch on the importance of balancing qualitative data with the lived experience of those experiencing environmental injustice and racism. So in Canada, we have several federal tools which are applied to evaluate various impacts of policies under consideration. Two key challenges exist with implementing these tools. So first is the availability of data to support the analysis of policy and its impacts. And the second is clear guidance to allow consistent application of these tools across federal departments and individual teams. So many of you are familiar with gender-based analysis plus or GBA plus. Briefly, GBA plus is an analytical process used to assess systemic inequalities and inform decision-making by highlighting how different populations experience policies, programs, and initiatives. Like GBA plus, environmental justice requires an intersectional lens that should be considered in decision-making. With that in mind, there's an opportunity to use the existing GBA plus tool as a venue for environmental justice considerations. Sorry. So with that in mind, so GBA plus could be adapted to include environmental justice considerations and objectives, which includes developing common tools and or leveraging existing processes where possible, providing access to resources to better identify or assess how a policy tool, objective, or program affects communities to support informed decision-making, most importantly. This is related both to identifying existing environmental justice issues and critically examining proposed solutions, providing guidance and best practices for consultation, both formal and informal, and or engagement with key partners and stakeholders with a focus on impacted communities that have been historically underrepresented in decision-making, and providing common goals and approaches to data collection, analysis, monitoring, and reporting. So GBA Plus will provide a useful tool or backdrop to identify environmental justice issues affecting marginalized communities from past, present, and or proposed policies, laws, and programs. So recent audits on the implementation of GBA Plus highlighted several barriers to its implementation, including training, timing, capacity, funding, data, measuring outcomes, accountability, and leadership. And also the perceptions and resistance that exist. So certain gaps in disaggregated data make it challenging to understand how diverse groups experience inequality. There have been reported challenges amongst departments around understanding the importance of gathering data, especially disaggregated data, and how to use it exactly. So this makes it especially challenging to know who is benefiting and where the issues may exist, particularly for those with intersecting identities. Further, GBA Plus as a tool, lens, or process is not well understood, which has hindered the ability to be embedded in decision-making processes. In Canada, the application of GBA Plus has raised conversations in recent years around challenges related to evaluating policies and programming. Moving from the world of policy to a world of regulations, federal regulatory proposals presented to Cabinet are required to include both a GBA Plus analysis and a cost-benefit analysis. Although Canadian guidance indicates that CBA should include a distributional analysis, there's currently limited guidance on how to disaggregate or present impacts across equity-seeking groups or other groups. So in both CBA distributional and GBA Plus analysis, metrics and indices to measure the distributional impacts of climate or other policies are underutilized. Income and expenditure-based indicators are the primary metrics used to evaluate the distributive implications of environmental, climate, and energy policies. However, they only provide a partial picture of the full distributional impacts of a policy. Another challenge is the proper valuation of non-market costs and benefits. Non-market valuation is increasingly included in Canadian CBA analysis. However, both market and non-market valuation methods are not always able to take into account different worldviews or preferences. For this reason, most cultural impacts are addressed qualitatively. In Canada, CBA does not, it's not monetized. So Environment and Climate Change Canada has internal guidance on how to approach this for species at risk regulations, but is not standardized across federal departments. Environment and Climate Change Canada is also in the process of developing guidance for CBA practitioners on available metrics for equity, diversity, and inclusion, and how they could be used to develop more sophisticated distributional analysis. This work is in the really early stages of development. So what's key? Get the quantitative metrics done right, then pay as much attention to ensure the qualitative analysis is also rigorous and sits on top of the quantitative. So as mentioned, Government Canada is in a unique position with the development, with policy development related to environmental justice still in its early stages. Legislation is anticipated to pass in the near future, which would require a study to link between race, socioeconomic status, and environmental risk, and information and statistics related to the location of environmental hazards. A baseline study is necessary to understand the distribution of environmental racism within the Canadian context. These efforts may inform broader environmental equity interventions, such as cost-benefit analysis. So early efforts to develop methodologies have demonstrated considerations around data and what analysis is possible on a national scale. So that includes the need to have clear indices, indicators, and targets to support comparisons at the national level, which present certain challenges as not all data sets are disaggregated at the same level of granularity. EJ issues occur at community and regional levels. However, data may not be available across those same granular levels, and lived experience and stories of affected communities are essential to convey the culture and historical context tied to instances of environmental injustice and racism and ground truth quantitative data. Regardless of the gaps, early quantitative research has demonstrated a need for analysis of procedural and recognitional justice, in addition to distributive studies. So historically, studies on environmental racism in Canada and the US have predominantly focused on outcomes, both toxin exposure levels and subsequent health outcomes, and not decision-making processes. These need to examine the decision-making processes that create disproportionate exposure of disadvantaged communities to industrial polluters, and environmentally hazard activities is increasingly being recognized in Canada. So for my closing reflections, and probably a segue into our next panel, I wanted to highlight a recent example that demonstrates meaningful engagement and brings the assessment of environmental policy and decision-making. So Aamjiwnaang First Nation is a community located in an area known as Petrochemical Valley. This is where citizens breathe some of the most toxic air in Canada. The First Nation exposed to benzene levels well above the acceptable level of risk for developing cancer. And the levels of benzene have steadily trending upwards over previous years. And it has been named an environmental sacrifice zone by the United Nations and others. In a letter to the Canadian Senate of Environment and Energy, Christopher Chief Plain noted that for over a century, the people of Aamjiwnaang First Nation have been forced to endure disproportionate environmental and health impacts from toxic industrial pollution in their territory. The constant pollution has caused disturbing health effects for the people of the community and has affected their cultural relationship with the land and waters by impacting the ability to engage in traditional practices. Just very quickly finish this one. So over the past months, we've been working very closely with the community of Aamjiwnaang and to establish a formal working group. The existing relationship that we had with the community and the understanding meant that in the face of Aamjiwnaang's state of emergency, which they declared because of those increased levels of benzene, it means that the department was able to collaboratively address the procedural challenges facing the community, working to understand their needs, provide the support they ask for, and develop actions. So from the Canadian government perspective, this action was actually precedent setting, demonstrating the ability of the federal and provincial counterparts to address communities' concerns by employing the legislative tools available, working collaboratively and expediting regulatory timelines. It has also demonstrated the importance of building relationships with communities where they are treated as partners, enabling open, honest conversations, and beyond the data, understanding the lived experience of community to realize meaningful actions. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. And as a reward for everyone being on time, there's time for questions. Yeah. So if you wish to ask one, put up your flag. Maybe while people are considering how to take advantage of the time, I have one. We're talking about environmental policies, which are usually making someone pay for pollution. And what I get thrown back at me is that this means only the rich can pay, and therefore this is the problem. Can we deal with this? So that's the question from me, but I'm also inviting colleagues in the room to raise their flags. There's one. Chuak, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to the OECD for organizing these very interesting exchanges. My name is Martin. I work for the Trade Union Advisory Committee to the OECD and represent trade unions in OECD countries. That's about 60 million workers. And a key concept for us is the concept of just transition that was forged in the 70s in the US, and that has gained international recognition in the Paris Agreement, talking about the need for just transition of the workforce, and the International Labour Organization's guidelines on ensuring a just transition that is making sure that no workers are left behind and that the jobs that would be created would be quality jobs, and knowing that they will not be equally distributed across regions and across groups. But I wanted to ask perhaps two questions on this international dimension of environmental justice. that is, of course, obviously really difficult, really complex, but I guess the question of equity and who is going to pay is at the heart of the discussions on mitigation policies, including at the COP, and this notion of common but differentiated responsibilities, and countries from the South not being willing nor having the capacities to pay for the transition. So I wanted to hear from the panelists whether you think that the current pledge and review system, where we have non-binding instruments, is actually fit for purpose in this context, or whether inevitably we will adopt more stringent, perhaps geographically limited binding instruments. That was my first question. And another one that is slightly related to that is related to transnational environmental justice and the role that multinational enterprises have in ensuring a just transition and environmental justice. I would be really happy to hear your views on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. If anyone else has questions, Colombia, please.
Oh, thanks. I wasn't expecting to take the floor so quickly, but anyway, this topic has been incredibly vibrant in Colombia. The question of participation in decisions on the environment, which is goes to the heart of the connections between our natural resource policy and our relations with communities, especially indigenous peoples. So what are and as we progress in the discussion in Colombia, I think we'll benefit a lot from hearing what is your views on the benefits of participation related to the cost of participation, because for some reason, several constituents in Colombia are inquiring about that very aspect, and so they fail to see how it adds up. So regardless of, I have a personal opinion, of course, but that doesn't matter. So I really want to hear your views on how to balance the two things and how to strike the right balance in that sense. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll take the United States, and then I'll give the panelists a chance to respond.
Thank you. This is Ann Wolverton. So I had a question focused on costs specifically. In the United States, we tend to think of the costs as being relevant in the environmental justice space on a kind of case-by-case basis, but it's also really difficult. So if the speakers have any insights into how to connect the dots between what we typically quantify on an aggregate basis, which at least in the United States is really compliance costs, and then the ultimate incidence of a policy, who ends up actually bearing the burden. And so thinking about the multiple channels, because it's not just necessarily about where the costs are initially imposed, but also what happens to prices, wages, and the cost of capital, which can of course then influence, but not only how we use that income to spend on goods and services, but also the sources of those incomes, and can really change. I think it makes it really challenging to think about that ultimate incidence, and I'd be curious if any of the presenters have any insights into that.
Thank you.
And sorry, and sorry, and for Professor Anatharaman, could you talk a little bit more about what expanding procedural access and benefits would look like? You talked a lot about some of the barriers that are in place, but can you talk more about what solutions could look like? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll pass the floor to the panelists. I don't know if you would like to start. You all have a chance to respond, and also Joseph online. Go
on. So I can start with your question. So in the end, it seems that we are saying that the rich should pay for the policies, but I think the problem behind the just transition is, how do you make the rich do the transition? Because it seems that they have the biggest capacity to make things change. So the problem is that there are many principles of justice, and if you are on the polluter pay principle, then it is just that that the rich pays. But if you think that it is just that we keep the previous rights the same, or you trying to keep them you're trying to keep them, then it is just to compensate the rich for the losses. And so you have two opposite policies for two principles you find just. And so I think this is the key, the core issue is we first have to admit what is just, what is fair, and so it is fair to compensate the poor or to compensate the rich, and so this is a big issue.
Thank you, Amanda. Do you want to come in?
Not yet.
Okay.
Not an economist, so I'll let her answer that.
And feel free to take all the questions that you want to answer.
All right, great.
Okay.
I guess I can, thank you so much. I can go, I'm also not an economist, so I will answer from my perspective of being a sociologist. So I think, going to this question of who is going to pay, part of this conversation is also maybe thinking about how are we quantifying costs and benefits, and what are our indicators and measures of this. So in some of our sociological work, there's also the importance of redefining value, right? And what, if we think about these issues as somewhat being interconnected, then yes, someone is going to have to pay perhaps more for some of these transition initiatives, but gain something else as a consequence of that. And I think the conversation on redefining value and a focus on, well, what are the different ways in which the benefits of some of these transitions can be communicated beyond, maybe the most economistic measures, through storytelling, through futuring, is an important role. I wanted to answer two quick questions. One is the role of multinational corporations in environmental justice. Well, I think the global plastics treaty negotiations that are currently taking place is quite indicative of perhaps the enduring and important role that multinational corporations play in influencing and negotiating various global processes that have justice implications. So where large multinational corporations, fossil fuel and chemical corporations, are very, very present at these negotiations in large numbers and are playing a pretty influential role in deciding what goes in texts, what gets included and what gets emphasized. Waste pickers and informal workers and trade unions are also present in smaller numbers and using their own techniques to try and influence the process and bringing in the perspectives from workers. So then to come to the important question of, well, what are some of the solutions? What can expanding procedural access and justice bring to the environmental conversation? So I think we've seen in some country contexts, for example, Brazil comes to mind, where strong associational activity by waste pickers and other informal workers has played a pretty important role in pushing environmental policies in directions that not only support workers, but also in some cases end up producing better environmental outcomes. So for example, by identifying problematic plastics that are hard to recycle and produce toxic impacts both at the production phase as well as the end of life phase, and pushing for those to be completely eliminated. So not just recycled, but eliminated from use. Similar examples in India where the involvement of waste picker organizing helped identify certain materials and push for more stringent environmental regulations than may have otherwise been accomplished. So that there are diverse knowledges that we can gain access to. I think the hubris that we know everything, that all of us in this room know everything that there is to be known, is a hubris. So increasing participation means increasing and diversifying the types of knowledges that are implicated in environmental policy making, as well as the different forms of kind of power and perspectives that can be leveraged in these political arenas for various environmental solutions.
So maybe I'll jump in and answer one of the questions specifically for Colombia. So I think in this one, striking the balance is really important, but it's impossible to say that it's a cookie cutter and one size fits all. So when we talk about our Indigenous peoples in Canada, we look at that very differently than how we would look at racialized or marginalized groups. And that is stemming from Canada's implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And so now there's Canadian legislation that requires free, prior, informed consent of any activities that may impact Indigenous peoples. But that said, with racialized and marginalized groups, I think what our research to date and what we've understand from working with some of the communities is some communities, what participation looks like is very different. And so you cannot have the one size fits all, and what that group may seem as restorative justice approaches could be very different than what in a, let's say, a federal context that we sit in, what might be the actions we may take. So it's trying to balance the two by giving the ability to enable those people to speak for themselves and to advocate for themselves as well. But all to say, in a nutshell, I think it's about striking that balance, and only you can decide that balance based off the issue that's there in discussions and collaborations with those impacted.
Thank you very much. Joseph, do you want to come in?
Sure, I'd be delighted. For good or bad, I am an economist, and so I'll bring all the strengths and weaknesses that brings. Economics has a lot of insight on some issues and angles and less on others. Stephen, you asked about the concept that only the rich can afford environmental quality. And to me, it brings to mind the concept that there are often missed opportunities for inexpensive pollution abatement that benefit everyone, and some of them disproportionately benefit low-income households. And many choices for the environment are society-wide choices, not just for individuals, and policy plays an important role. And one example that comes to mind is preventing wildfires by doing preventative burns, which is inexpensive, but can have very broad air quality benefits. And recent research I've done with others in the US finds if you quantify the benefits and costs of policies that decrease particulate matter air pollution, the benefits are typically far above 10 times the costs. That's in the US, where there's already been immense investment to clean up air quality. And so in other settings with worse air quality, those relative benefits and costs can be even more beneficial. The participant from Colombia asked a similar question. How do you balance benefits and costs? Different policy instruments can lead to really different balance. The trade union representative asked about multinational firms. I think one underappreciated potential, you could worry about multinational firms creating emissions from dirty plants, but an unrealized potential is to participate in climate finance. There's a lot of multinational firms with extraordinary technology in solar and wind and clean gasoline vehicles and other clean technologies that can find it profitable to move those technologies and production and goods around the world. And of course, one has to be cognizant of the pros and cons of foreign investment. But I think there is unrealized opportunity to see multinational firms' technology as an opportunity rather than a challenge to deal with climate finance and environmental quality. And then last, Ann Wolverton from the US asked about how to measure costs through all those different dimensions: product markets, labor markets, capital markets. I would add another, which is neighborhood impacts. Local investment has costs and benefits to cities and communities. There are some kind of traditional methods of trying to look at all of those channels together, large economy-wide general equilibrium models. I think also analysis and policy has focused a lot on the benefits of environmental quality, and the measurement of costs of environmental policy often uses accounting or engineering estimates, where someone says, this is the physical cost of installing and operating pollution control technology. As you emphasize, there are many other costs. There is an emerging literature in a branch of research called spatial or economic geography, which tries to incorporate many of these channels. I think that's an exciting new frontier, but I agree there's no one size fits all way to measure the important question of what are the costs through all those different channels of environmental policy.
Thank you very much. I think the good news is if there's a safe space for economists, the OECD is probably it. So you don't need to be too afraid to be an economist here. I'd like to thank the speakers. I'm not entirely sure we answered all the questions fully. I think some of them will come back up tomorrow as we come into the kind of frontiers, for example, cumulative costs and how they're passed through, is something we'll come back to again and again, because it's what decides how people vote, which is quite important. I'm going to pass on the floor to Mathilde Mesnard from the OECD to take control.